Everywhere we go, we are confronted with rules and laws. And a lot of times we're not really aware of it. In a culture, in a society, in a particular context, we often just know what the rules are. We know what the laws are, and we don't really think about it. But it's useful sometimes to take note of the rules, of the laws that are in place, and to wonder why those rules and those laws are in place. And so we look here at the sign, and we have a couple rules here. One rule is that you can't go faster than 30 miles an hour on this road. And then there's a rule down below that says no through trucks, which I think must mean none of the big, 18-wheeler trucks going down that road. So we have a rule in this area, which is mostly residential. Don't go faster than 30 miles an hour. That's the rule, that's the law. And I have seen people on this road pulled over by the police for breaking this law. So we know what the law is. The law is easy to read and it's easy to understand. But is there an underlying principle? And I think at least one underlying principle, and if we thought about it, we could probably think of multiple underlying principles, but one underlying principle is that, remember, we're in a residential area. And so when you're in a residential area and when people are potentially out and about, when you have cars coming out of different roads, and I think especially when you have children potentially in that area, then you want to take some extra care. An underlying principle here would be that when you're driving, what can be potentially a dangerous vehicle if it collides with something else, when you're driving in a context where there are a lot of people, a lot of other cars. Of course, in this photograph you don't see a lot of other cars, but at certain times of the day the cars do stack up. A lot of people, homes, pets, children, there's a school down the street. In that kind of context especially, we should take care. So there's a principle, and then there's the law that is there to remind us, specifically how to act on that principle. And then there are the police who will enforce the law. Here's a rule, and you see we have the fire hydrant, and then down below it says fire lane. And so the law is don't park your car in a place where there's red paint, right? Because if there's a fire, then the fire engine needs to come and have a place to plug into the fire hydrant and then to deal with the fire. Underlying principle that we need to prepare for future problems. We have buildings close by. We want to put out the fires quickly. We need to plan ahead. And so if a fire truck needs to come to this place, then we don't need the problem of needing to find space for that truck. And so there's an underlying principle here that we need to make some preparation for future problems, in this case, fire. And so if you park where that red paint is, then you're likely to get a ticket. Here we have not really a law, but we do have a rule, and that is don't walk your dogs through the cemetery. And I don't think there's much of a mystery about why this is so, because dogs will relieve themselves. The dogs don't make a distinction between cemeteries or other places when they're out for a walk. There's the underlying principle that the dead should be respected. It's not a good idea to drive your car through a cemetery, cranking music very loudly. It's not okay to organize a football game in the middle of a cemetery. It's not okay to walk a dog through a cemetery because of what the dog might do, right? And there's this underlying principle that the place where the dead are buried should be a place of relative quiet and relative respect. So we have laws, we have rules, we have underlying principles. Here's another rule. Don't talk on your cell phone when you're in the cardio room. And an underlying principle here is that other people's space should be respected. And so if you're in a small exercise room where people are potentially packed in pretty tightly, and this person here is on the machine, and then the person on the other machine is talking loudly into a cell phone, then that can be really irritating, right? And it's not in our interest for people to get irritated at the gym, because who knows, then maybe a fight may break out. Let's just be respectful of one another's space. Here the underlying principle is just respect other people's space. Now sometimes, of course, we have rules that are debatable, rules that people might call into question. Now, I've been in that room when people are speaking very loudly into their cell phones, and so, I mean, people, clearly break rules. People clearly speed. The sign says 30 miles and they're doing 45. The sign says no through trucks, but there's an 18-wheeler going down the street. So people break rules, but I think even people who break this rule, understand the underlying principle. In other cases, though, we have rules where people really can disagree. So this is a photograph that I just took in an airport. Please wear a face covering, maintain space between others throughout your journey. The face covering is required on board your flight. So there's debate about whether, the mask wearing and whether, a lot of the things that have gone along with the coronavirus pandemic. There's a debate about whether the lockdowns, just to use a general phrase, whether the lockdowns have been on the whole beneficial, or whether they've been on the whole, whether they've done more harm than good. And people have different opinions about that. And so you've got a lot of rules related to the coronavirus pandemic lockdown. But there is debate about whether these rules are really good rules. Now, in my case, one of the things I noticed is that when we got on the plane, we had to socially distance. That is, we have to be 6 feet apart as we're getting on the plane. As we get off the plane, each row gets up and walks out, and then the next row gets up and walks out to try to maintain the social distance. But then the curious thing is that when you're actually, flying on the plane for the 2-hour flight, you're packed in more tightly. So it is difficult to make sense of all of these rules about social distancing in the airport, social distancing, as you're getting on and off the plane, when you're actually spending an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours on the plane, packed in very tightly. It's hard to make sense of these things. And so this is where some of the debates come from. I do think that even underlying, or even among those who question the lockdowns, etc., the rules associated with them, I think most of them will recognize that there is an underlying principle that informs the lockdowns, that shape the lockdowns, and that is, taking care of public health, looking out for one another, trying to do what we can to prevent sickness from being passed from one person to another. There is an underlying principle. I think that the dispute becomes, what's the best way to act on that principle, and do some actions cost more than they're worth? So laws, rules, it's not always crystal clear. Sometimes it's clear, sometimes it's less clear. And then sometimes there are immoral rules. There are evil rules. So for example, in the Netherlands during the Second World War, a rule was that if you knew where Jews were, then you needed to let the Nazi authorities know, because the Nazi regime, one of its goals is to eliminate all of the Jews of Europe. So this is a rule, this is a law. And if you happen to be a Dutch person in the Netherlands who is hiding a Jew to prevent that Jew from falling into the hands of the Nazis, if you are hiding a Jewish family, then you are breaking a law. You are breaking a rule. But I think in this case, I think everyone would agree that, yeah, this is a rule in the sense that a government wrote this down and said, this is a rule, this is a law, and if you don't obey this law, you don't obey this rule, you'll be punished. But I think everyone would agree that this is a rule, this is a law that is immoral. This is a rule, this is a law that is evil. And so when Anne Frank, you see her photo there, when she and her family are hiding out in that home, they are breaking a law, and the people who are helping them hide are breaking a law. But the law in this case, I think we would agree, is pretty clearly evil. So just because something is a law, just because something is a rule, doesn't mean it's good. Some rules, I think most of the rules we live with, yeah, they make some sense. Some of the rules we live with, we might question them, but we wouldn't call them evil. We might say, well, they're misguided. In this case, I think we would say that the law is evil. And therefore, the right thing to do is to resist the law, is to act against the law in some way, right? Now then we have laws that might have made perfect sense in history but no longer do. Here's a law from the Code of Hammurabi from ancient Mesopotamia. If anyone receive into his house a runaway male or female slave of the court and does not bring it out at the public proclamation, the master of the house shall be put to death. So if you are the master of a home, sort of the head of a home, a head of a house, and you have a runaway slave living in your house, and then there's a proclamation, such and such person is a runaway slave, and you don't hand that slave over, then you can be put to death. Now what this points us to is that in ancient Mesopotamia, as was true all around the world until very recently in human history, slavery was taken for granted. Slavery was normal. And so this law makes sense to most people, if not all of them, in ancient Mesopotamia. Of course, it wouldn't make sense today. Today, a law like this would be one that I think we would classify as an evil law, as an immoral law. And so thoughts about ethics, thoughts about morality certainly can change. It may be that some moral ideas are eternal, right? Other moral ideas, I think, clearly do change, and this is a case where, in recent times in human history, there's a general consensus now, obviously, that slavery is wrong, and so this law that makes sense historically, I think, obviously, we would resist it today. Let's look at a couple other laws from Hammurabi. If a physician makes a large incision with the operating knife and kill him, or open a tumor with the operating knife and cut out the eye, his hands shall be cut off. In other words, if a physician is making an incision and what does it say, and kills the person he's operating on, or cuts out the eye of the person he's operating on, then the physician's hands will be cut off. So this is very severe, and I think this would be a strong disincentive to become a doctor in ancient Mesopotamia. I don't think I would want to take a risk, right, to be a doctor. There is an underlying principle, and I think we would all agree that that's a very harsh punishment, right? So I don't think we would advocate that kind of punishment today. There is an underlying principle, and the underlying principle is that when the physician has a person in his or her care, then of course the physician should do the best he or she can, right? So there is an underlying principle. I think we disagree on how that principle is being acted on. If a builder build a house for someone and does not construct it properly, and the house which he built fall in and kill its owner, then that builder shall be put to death, right? So again, I think we would consider this law harsh, but there is an underlying principle. If you build a home for somebody, build it well, right? If you build a home for someone, you should build it well. And this law is there as an incentive. So I think we can see the principle. I think we would disagree with the remedy. We come to an ancient Egyptian concept of Ma'at. Ma'at, the goddess personifying justice, truth, and the harmony of the universe, the divine order of the universe. And the symbol for Ma'at in hieroglyphs will be the female figure you see there with the feather on the top of the head, or sometimes just a feather. Here we have a judgment scene from ancient Egypt. A heart is being weighed on one side of a scale, a feather on the other side, and you want it to balance out. And it might be a little hard to see, but right in the middle of the scale is the symbol for Ma'at, right? And there's an ancient Egyptian conception that when we die, we are judged, and our heart is put on one side of a scale, and Ma'at is put on the feather, representing Ma'at is put on the other side of the scale, and they need to balance out. Okay? And so what do? Well, we perform what's called the negative confession. I have not done a whole bunch of things, right? So, and each of these negative confessions, starts out with hailing different gods and things like that, hailing different names. But let's just go to the end of these three statements. So here you are on Judgment Day, your heart is being weighed against the feather of my eye, and you say, I have not stolen. In my life I did not steal. Okay? So this implies a rule, this implies a law. Don't steal. Okay? What's the underlying principle? Well, I think we could think of a number of things, but one of the underlying principles would be that, look, we can't have an orderly society. We can't have a secure society. We can't have a prosperous society if we can't trust one another, right? And societies in which people cannot trust one another, one of the characteristics of that kind of society usually is a high degree of theft. You leave your bike out in front of your house and it's gone, right? You grew up where I grew up, you can even chain up your bike, lock up your bike with chains, and it's still gonna disappear, right? In that kind of society, if you're in a place where you have to continually look out over your shoulder, you have to continually have to check to make sure your wallet is still in your pocket, that's not a secure society, right? We want to have a secure society, so we need to respect one another's property, right? So that's kind of an underlying principle. It's reflected in the law, don't steal, right? And the Egyptians say, and if you do steal, apart from whatever punishment you face on earth, you also have to face consequences in the afterlife. I have not slain men and women. In other words, I haven't murdered people. I think the underlying principle would be pretty similar. If you walk down the street, you want to have confidence that you are secure. You want to know that that it's a place of security and safety. Last one, I have not uttered lies. Underlying principle, I think again about trust, right? If we want to have a society of trust, then this means we basically need to be able to trust what people say. We need to trust that people aren't going to intentionally mislead us, right? We have to trust that if, to connect it to what we saw in Hammurabi, that if the house builder tells us that he that he did the best he could, that he had the best materials, that he put meticulous care into building this home, we want to just assume that he's telling us the truth. We don't want to assume that actually what he's saying is not true. And there are a lot of places in the world where, people just take it for granted that you cannot really trust what other people tell you. It's hard to have a good society that way. And so although these laws, these rules, the laws and rules that are kind of referred to here, don't steal, don't kill, don't murder, don't lie, right? Which also are of course in the Ten Commandments from the ancient Hebrews. So these are the things we say in the afterlife and in Judgment Day, and they're reflected in law. Don't steal, don't kill, don't lie. And underneath that law are principles, right? Life goes better if we can trust one another. Life goes better if we have security and safety. Life goes better if we respect one another's property. So what you're going to see on the next two screens, I'm going to stop talking, and what you're going to see on the next two screens are some excerpts from the Code of Hammurabi, ancient Mesopotamia, and you're going to see some excerpts from the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the Negative Confession. And what I encourage you to do is look through these laws, ancient Mesopotamia, Hammurabi, look through the Negative Confession, which points us to ancient laws from ancient Egypt. And just as you go through them, ask yourself, what are the underlying principles, right? And we may find that we disagree with some of the things that are said, but still, let's look for those underlying principles. What are the underlying principles at work? And if we do find that we disagree with some of the laws or how the rules are expressed, then we can ask ourselves why. What is it that we think is problematic with the rule or with the implied rule, with the law, with the implied law?